assimilation has failed because people usually, whether out of spite or habit, move to a new country, establish enclaves with people like them, and recreate the conditions of their home country, and just establish little Mogadishus or little Lahores in our major towns and cities. And so this is a direct consequence of just people being here. And so it's a demographic reality. And so yes, we need to be a culturally coherent country, but that also means that the white British majority need to remain an unquestionable demographic majority in their own country.
I want to start by talking about Sarah Pouchin, the Reform MP's comments around representation of white people and black people in adverts on television. Do you think she was right to apologise for pointing out that there's an overrepresentation of ethnic minorities in adverts?
No, I don't think she was right to apologise. I think actually her response to the unwillingness to accept her apology by the collective political left has been the correct response. So she was referring to, in a segment on a different broadcast outlet, a study by Channel 4 that found that there are black people in up to 50% of Britain's adverts. Now, as a Zoomer who does not have a TV licence because he doesn't watch live TV, I don't get a lot of advertising outside of that sort of global digital on YouTube, the sort of AI-generated slop that I can't stand. But when I do visit my parents and grandparents and happen to catch the odd terrestrial TV spot, you do notice conspicuously a number of mixed-race relationships that just aren't walking around on the streets of Britain. And so having over 50% of the adverts feature black people just does not represent the reality we see outside. So it either looks like one of two things. It looks like all of the advertising companies and various companies looking to flog their wares on terrestrial television are complying with individual diversity, equity and inclusion mandates that have been imposed upon them either by internal company HR or because they're trying to secure environmental, social and governance score investment from international hedge funds, from their investors. And so you have a preference cascade where everyone is doing it independently, but when aggregated, when adverts are played back to back, you look like you're living in Nigeria. Or it is interpreted, whether or not it is, as an exercise in social engineering. And social engineering is behind things like environmental, social and governance scores, these sort of corporate social responsibility metrics that say that corporations, because they are public actors, have to be anti-racist, have to be responsible in terms of their carbon emissions, have to provide gender-inclusive environments to their LGBTQ plus staff members. And so that plays out in all of their private and public conduct, including their advertising. In either respect, Sarah Pouchin's comments were right. People are just instinctively frustrated by feeling gaslit about not being present in adverts on the television in their own country. And the more important point, Stephen, is you shouldn't apologise to your political enemies who are not going to give you the same good grace that someone on your own side would. Because to the modern left, for whom there is no objective truth, for whom all culture is relative, for whom they believe that we exist in a system of oppression and any action, including in many cases, per the assassination of Charlie Kirk, violence is justified in tearing down that system of oppression. They don't believe in honesty and ethical consistency, and they certainly don't extend the same tolerance to our side as they do to members of their own side when they engage in a diversity of tactics. And so, as we've seen with the group chat leaks in America by Politico, as we've seen with the set 2 between Christian Calgi and Zara Sultana, and now as we've seen with the argument between Sarah Pouchin and even members of Labour's front bench, like Wes Streeting, even if you apologise in good faith to the people who you have sincerely offended by clumsy comments, you will not receive any forgiveness. And so there's no point trying to apologise to people that ultimately just want to use your good grace as a pretext to cancel and shun you from society for political reasons.
Now, like you say, Wes Streeting said that these comments were mean and racist. Pouchin said in this interview, "It drives me mad when I see adverts full of black people, full of Asian people. It doesn't reflect our society. Your average white person, average white family is not represented anymore." She says that her comments were phrased poorly, but she still agrees with the point that black people are overrepresented. What about the phrasing of it? You know, it drives me mad seeing black people, Asian people on TV.
Well, I don't think the phrasing should be quibbled with. You're allowed to have an emotional expression about feeling gaslit, about being not the majority in your own country. And I don't think she should have even apologised for the phrasing. It's a bit like way back when Lee Anderson on GB News had said that he was frustrated about Sadiq Khan's lenience towards the protesters that had occupied, at that point, Westminster every weekend and Wednesday since the October the 7th massacre. And he apologised for his clumsy phrasing, which got him kicked out of the Conservative Party, but the sentiment was correct. And Sadiq Khan has been engaging in two-tier policing with these protests versus the mostly peaceful Unite the Kingdom rally, which he and members of the Labour frontbench yet again called unrepentantly far-right and racist, and thereby beyond the pale and subject to moral condemnation as the lowest possible point of our political order. And so I don't think Sarah should have apologised. She's speaking what, frankly, people say in pubs and at supermarket checkouts all across the country, and I think this frankness is actually the reason why Reform UK are riding so high consistently in the polls, because people see them as a political hand grenade thrown at the two zombies of Labour and Conservatives propped up against each other, as Peter Hitchens once described, the uniparty that seemed to agree on how to portray the British public every 6 ways from Sunday when they vote for something at one election and get the exact opposite. And so this frankness, this just saying we aren't represented in our own media, in our own country, is refreshing. And if I may just finish on this one thing, Hannah Pitkin did a book on representation. She defined representation quite simply as making something present where it has otherwise been absent. So it's about making a set of priorities about what you think is important and pushing it to the forefront, which means you are also precluding something when you are not representing it. And so, if there are 50% of black people in the adverts in this country, someone, somewhere, has said it is important to make sure that fewer white people are on screen and more black people are on screen. So, if someone can make that demand, if someone can constantly agitate for more black people in the countryside, otherwise it's racist, more Pakistani MPs in Parliament to represent various communities imported into our country, then they can make that demand. The inverse demand can be made. And the only reason they're saying this is racist and unacceptable is because the demand is being made about the indigenous population who happen to be white in this country, which just shows that certain politicians in this country have contempt for the indigenous population, and that's not going to bear very well for their poll numbers.
What about this argument that it doesn't matter who is on adverts? This is just triggered right-wing boomers who are, upset about seeing ethnic minorities on the TV. This is all just some right-wing ridiculous backlash, and as I say, people just being triggered by nothing at all.
Okay, if it doesn't matter, let's have all white adverts then. Oh no, okay, it does matter because you've been pushing for non-white adverts for a very long time. So therefore, the gaslighting of, well, it doesn't matter, I'm not going to take that from people for whom representation does in fact matter. What they're trying to say is that you are causing issues with us achieving our guiding North Star of the principle of absolute equality. And between now and living in the John Lennon's imagined utopia where there are no racial, class, sexual preference differences, and we can all hold hands and sing Kumbaya, we can procedurally discriminate against you on the grounds of your identity, even if you have personally done nothing wrong. And so we've heard from people in the advertising industry, people who are actors, comedians, writers, etc. There's a long procession of people in the entertainment industry who have been individually discriminated against, not on the grounds of merit, but on the grounds of their race, especially after the George Floyd riots by Black Lives Matter in 2020, where suddenly the West underwent this collective cultural revolution where the overwhelming majority of brand new jobs, for example, in S&P 500 companies were given to black people. They basically invented whole cloths to rectify perceived imbalances in racial equity. And so if it matters that much to them, when we point out that it matters that much to them and they've gone way too far to the point of where it's obvious to everyone, they then can't turn around and say, why do you care so much?
What do you make of the black representation in historical dramas? We've seen in recent years the BBC and others pushing this. So there was a recent TV programme about the Battle of Hastings and the Norman Conquest, in which Anglo-Saxon lords were black. We've seen kings and queens of England's kings and queens being represented as black characters. Is this problematic, or is this brilliant representation? It's diversity at its best, and it doesn't matter which way you kind of characterize or represent historical figures, whether it's black or white?
Well, they couldn't ask for a better person to steelman their arguments than you, Stephen. This is obviously absurd, and the purpose of creating fiction or even biopics and historical drama is to immerse you in a world, which means that you need the fewest possible barriers to you suspending your disbelief and buying in, or the fewest possible barriers to you believing that this is an accurate depiction of history in order for you to get invested in the narrative. And so, as there was a Black Anne Boleyn, or recently there have been characters in wheelchairs descending through dungeons in Dungeons and Dragons, that means that you failed in your ability to create a convincing historical drama or a work of fiction, because I just don't believe it. Like, the problem with racial recasting is, especially in established properties and especially in historical dramas, is that it just isn't accurate. I can't believe it, and therefore I cannot get invested. And so the work of fiction is no longer to entertain or inspire or inform, it is instead to make something present where it was otherwise absent. AKA, it's an exercise in social engineering. And what are they trying to socially engineer? Okay, it's the same argument that there was in a recent Horrible Histories episode. There was a song saying "We've been here from the start," saying that Cheddar Man was black, Roman emperors were black, Henry VIII had one trumpeter who was a bit darker, therefore the Windrush generation settled Britain, I suppose. What they're trying to do in this historical revisionism, in this racial recasting in history, is make you believe that basically all our history has been Bridgerton. And therefore, if we have always been diverse, if we have always been multi-ethnic, multiracial, and multicultural, you therefore can't argue for the policies that would correct Britain back to a homogenous, culturally coherent civilization that we had for the 1,000 years between the Battle of Hastings and 1945, where a maximum of only 5% of our ethnic makeup as an island was non-cohesive. Like, we had more immigration since 1997 than between 1066 and 1945. The Norman Conquest left an infinitesimally small genetic footprint on our country, but for some reason we're currently arguing that because we had Viking invaders and the Norman conquests, and Cheddar Man was somehow black, therefore we can't resist the Boris wave and remove indefinite leave to remain. It's a massive gaslighting exercise to say that your history, your heritage, your identity doesn't matter, it's fundamentally replaceable, and we can continue with the unwanted demographic experiment of mass migration and multiculturalism, as we already have.
It's also interesting that when they make historical dramas about black people, they are never cast as white characters. You'd never see a white MLK Jr. or Malcolm X or some King of Africa or wherever in some Netflix show, which would be an interesting experiment, I'm sure. What about the casting of fictional characters like James Bond? Would you be worried if he was a black guy being cast as James Bond?
I wouldn't be worried, I just wouldn't buy into it. Like, for me, so one of the main reasons I actually got into politics, and this is a bit of niche personal lore, is because I've always been a massive comic book nerd, and back in 2011, DC Comics rebooted their entire universe, including Superman, who had been published consecutively, even weekly, since 1938 up until that point, and they reset it from issue number 1. And by rebooting that universe, they recast some of the characters, and one of my favourite characters was Wally West. He was the sidekick to the Flash ever since the sort of 1950s and 60s. When his mentor had died, he'd taken up the mantle and become a hero in his own right and had a cult following, and he disappeared from the universe. And when he was brought back as hip, new, young, African-American Wallace West. And when people said, well, where's my favourite character I've gotten attached to in the cartoons and the comics, who I feel like I've grown up looking at, who went from a kid to a dad in the same way that I did when I was buying these comics, they just said, that's because you're a racist. And so, if you insult your own fans, if you inherit a long-standing property, whether historical or fictional, and then you wear it as a skin suit, as a means of advancing your own racial grievance politics, your own ability to enrich and empower yourself, then you are ungrateful, you have failed at the task of being a writer and a creative, and what ends up happening is, as we've seen with the failures of Marvel and Star Wars and the DC universe, with the rise of things like imported manga and the decline of the comics industry, with the fall off in advertising rates and the viewership of terrestrial television, including the things like Doctor Who, another thing that they've pillaged the corpse of from my childhood, people just start tuning out. And it's because you can't subject people to the enforcement cost of having them deny their own eyes, ears, and intuitions for long enough for them to keep tuning in when they have better things to do with their time. And so if James Bond is recast as a black actor, I'm sure there are plenty of capable black actors to play characters like James Bond, but Ian Fleming envisioned James Bond as an Englishman. That means he's white. And that is not a moral judgment on people who aren't white, but it does mean that if you want to play James Bond, you should be a white Englishman. If you want to make other similar characters, create your own IP like Idris Elba did with Luther.
You mentioned earlier that the reason that they're trying to recast our history and even, well, probably fictional narratives as well in a way, is to destroy arguments against, say, remigration or mass deportations. Katie Lamb, who is a Conservative Member of Parliament, she has been criticised by her own party. We saw in The Guardian recently a report that members of the Conservative Party in Parliament are worried about her comments about deporting people who are legally in Britain. What do you make of these criticisms? What do you make of Katie Lamb's arguments? And I don't know if you saw, but there was a Labour MP who even today was tweeting saying, Katie Lamb wants to deport, doctors and social care people and retired people, and that would be terrible.
Okay, so first of all, despite what the defenders of the Boris wave may say, it's less than 3% of people who were imported since post-Brexit were doctors and nurses. And even then, internal NHS reports find that foreign doctors are up to 2.5 times more likely to commit medical malpractice. I would be interested to see the breakdown by nationality for that, because I think certain nationalities are going to be more likely than others, given cultural priors. And we had even The Guardian reporting that Nigerian nurses have committed industrial-scale qualifications fraud in order to get their placements here. As well with social care workers, they bring far more dependents, if they're from Nigeria, Ghana, or Zimbabwe, than they do actual workers. All of them are paid by the taxpayer, which means that they are never net tax contributors in their lifetimes. It's low-wage work. This also doesn't bring into consideration any of the cultural change factors that these people bring to bear on our civilization by being here. Our country is not just a global bus stop or a job centre, it is a home, and we would like to fill it with familiar faces and not total strangers, as Keir Starmer once said, and then retracted. As far as the Conservative Party throwing Katie Lamb under the bus, it doesn't shock me, because these reckless demographic vandals engaged in this mass migration experiment at the expense and against the wishes of the population, who have voted against it in every election and referendum when asked since 1974, and been punished with higher levels of migration and multicultural appeasement as a result. And so it's pretty hard to argue with some of the same people that oversaw this experiment still in the shadow cabinet, like Priti Patel, that you are qualified to clean up the mess that you made. I think actually only Katie Lamb and people like Nick Timothy and Robert Jenrick, who have dissented from the Home Office orthodoxy at the time, have credibility on this issue. Katie Lamb herself, a fresh-faced new Tory with none of the baggage of her party. But as far as Katie Lamb's argument that we should be a culturally cohesive country, yes. However, the framing here, I must take issue with this, and I understand that politicians are sometimes a bit behind the times of commentators and journalists and academics. The framing here is misguided, because it's all well and good to be a culturally cohesive country, but that culture rests on certain demographic givens. Culture is preceded by people. A country is preceded by people. People do not become a people because they are in a given landmass, specifically. In terms of countries, they are founded, or spring organically from, a tribe of people, a collection of families with a given religion, a certain way of life, who over time expand and build up the area, and their habits and practices become a distinct culture that, yes, can be named after those people, but just abiding by that culture does not make you that people. And even if the culture is broken or frayed or forgotten, for example, there's various Soviet states that were occupied by the USSR, who are now free and part of the European Union, they can replenish their own culture and recover from economic privation as long as they remain the same people. And so, yes, I agree, we should be culturally coherent. Yes, I agree, for the handful of friendly minorities who are genuinely inclined to assimilate to our country, to renounce their prior loyalties, to adopt the state religion, to marry into our tribe, we should be pushing for, as Robert Jenrick said, assimilation. But we're not talking about pushing for cultural coherence and assimilation as hypotheticals now. Assimilation has failed because people usually whether out of spite or habit, move to a new country, establish enclaves with people like them, and recreate the conditions of their home country, and just establish little Mogadishus or little Lahores in our major towns and cities. And so this is a direct consequence of just people being here. And so it's a demographic reality. And so yes, we need to be a culturally coherent country, but that also means that the white British majority need to remain an unquestionable demographic majority in their own country, and it should be unthinkable for us to become a minority, as projected by 2063, before the 1,000-year anniversary of the Battle of Hastings, especially because I don't think if we're a minority, we'll be afforded the same protections and good graces that minorities have over and above the host population in our country at the moment. And so politicians should be courageous enough to say, yes, we want assimilation, yes, we want to be a cultural majority, but that is contingent on the white British never becoming a minority in their own country. Just as if the Japanese were no longer a majority in Japan, it would cease to be Japan, and just as if the Jews were no longer a majority in Israel, Israel would cease to be too. I think we should have the same standard here in England.
Let's move on to illegal migration. We've seen some scandals in the last few weeks in particular around this. First of all, I want to talk about this report that's come out from members of Parliament criticising the Home Office for wasting billions of pounds on the migrant hotel scheme. You've got contractors making billions and billions and billions off the taxpayer.
Back in 2024, we found out via Dame Andrea Jenkins, when she was still a member of Parliament for the Conservatives, that the government was spending £14.4 billion on illegal migration, mainly out of the foreign aid budget in our own country. And that includes not just hotel fees for asylum applicants, but also legal aid, and as has been revealed by the Telegraph before, things like DJ lessons and day trips to the seaside. There was also Home Office report some time ago that said that the migrants themselves had been treating their own accommodation rather ungratefully, and one had even attempted to set fire to the minibus that was taking them on said day trips. So it's not just the scale of cost for illegal migration in this country, it's the principle of we should not be paying a penny to foreign criminals who never need to be in this country in the first place. And yes, that sounds harsh, but every single person who has broken into this country, whether or not they apply for asylum upon arrival, has committed a crime by the first interaction with the British state, which means that all of them are willing to commit one crime, many of them are willing to commit others. And we know ahead of their arrival, thanks to a story that I helped Mark Whitebreak for GB News in August of 2023, that these people smuggling gangs have been targeting men from North Africa, mainly Algeria and Morocco, with videos of girls in Britain, in London, in Manchester, etc., on nights out in states of undress by Islamic standards, looking very immodest, and filming them without the consent to then show to prospective people trafficking customers to say, look at what awaits you when you get to Europe. And there were also videos on these accounts on Instagram and on TikTok of burning churches, wads of money being thrown around, very reminiscent of the Albanian people smuggling TikToks, the sort of travel agency for illegal migration that Nigel Farage revealed on his show that same year. So we shouldn't be putting up with people who declare their predatory intent ahead of arriving in our country being given 4 to 5 star accommodation at the expense of the natives. The only conceivable way that this is justified is existing human rights legislation. And human rights legislation, as David Starkey has explained in many interviews with you before, is premised on this belief after the Second World War that countries are incapable of governing themselves because the likes of the Nazis committed atrocities. And so we needed international bodies to act as permanent watchdogs like the United Nations or the International Courts of Justice or the European Convention and Court of Human Rights to ensure that countries would prosecute their war criminals, which some didn't after the First World War, and would be able to prosecute war criminals if these countries came into conflict, like with the Nuremberg trials. The issue that you have is that there's no such thing as a neutral law, and there's no such thing as a law that can govern all people in all times and all places, because these laws are premised on the idea of a blank slate human nature. The idea that we were all free and we were all equal, and it's only society's arbitrary oppression that has rendered us apart. It's only the happenstance of geography and economic and education disparities that a sufficient state could remedy, and therefore, if we all use our reason and we dig down deep beneath cultural differences, we can create one body of law and one form of politics that is suitable for all mankind. This is the mentality that drove the failed regime change and nation-building efforts of America in Iraq, Libya, Syria, Afghanistan, and it's the reason why we remain hamstrung now to deport illegal sexual predators that have been... There's been a number of examples of this that have come over the channel in recent years, because we still believe that there is a body of law that will tap into this latent egalitarian human nature and make even these foreign criminals that are residing in Britain's hotels eventually as British as you and me. I just think we need to repeal these laws, abandon this failed multicultural utopian ideology, and get foreign criminals out of our country and save us all the expense.
Let's talk about Hadush Kebatu. This is a man who sexually assaulted a 14-year-old girl and another woman in Epping. And David Lammy says that he's going to be deported this week. But he was released by accident by the prison, the jail people, and he started wandering around parts of London, parts of Britain, ready potentially to reoffend. He was described as someone who was likely to reoffend. What do you make of this absolute catastrophe, this complete blunder, arresting this guy and then releasing him from prison?
It would almost be comedic, sort of Mr. Bean-like, if this weren't a foreign sex offender who never needed to be in the country in the first place to ruin and do worse people's lives. So he was out for about 44 hours before his trainers gave him away in one of the most surveilled cities in the country. It's pretty appalling that the police can track you down for a tweet they don't like and raid your house in the dead of night if you post an anti-Hamas meme, in the cases of Pete North or Alison Pearson. But sex offenders, foreign sex offenders, get a slap on the wrist and carte blanche to wander around and then be picked up in of all places, Finsbury Park. What I found most disturbing, though, Stephen, was just how broken the judiciary is, as exemplified by this case. When Kebatu was sentenced, they said that he was a man of good character because he had no prior offences committed in Britain or the countries he had moved through before he came here. Bear in mind, he was only in the country 8 days before he attempted to sexually predate on multiple women, not just this 14-year-old girl. And also, in the absence of evidence, why would we presume this man is of good character and has committed no other offences in any other country? He certainly isn't of good character for the sex offence he committed and breaking into our country. And I would say that literally nobody, whether they're foreign or British born, is of good character if you've committed a child sex offence. Even if it's your first one. Funnily enough, I've managed to never do that throughout my lifetime. I'm sure there are plenty of people who have resisted the urge of ruining a 14-year-old girl's life with unwanted advances, who can probably consider themselves of good character. I don't think that consideration extends to Mr. Kebatu. The point that this story underscores, the point that all of these crimes committed by illegal migrants, including the chap who murdered Rhiannon Sky White, who should have been still rotting in the Horn of Africa rather than stabbing her in the head with a screwdriver 19 times. The point that all of these abhorrent cases of foreign crime make is that no matter how few people try to argue it is per the proportion of the migrant population, every single instance of crime committed by an immigrant is a consequence of government policy, because that criminal never needed to be in the country in the first place. Yes, we have domestic criminals. Yes, we should be incarcerating them for far longer, far harsher. I think we should take a Nayib Bukele approach to this in order to deter other criminals who think they can get away with it. However, just because we have our own domestic criminals doesn't mean we need to become the #1 nation in Western Europe and #2 nation in all of Europe for crimes committed by foreign nationals according to the Global Organised Crime Index. And that's created by far-right conspiracy outlet, the US government. So I think that we shouldn't be subjecting our women and girls to predation by foreign sex offenders. I think that we shouldn't be getting robbed and scammed and in some cases killed by insane foreign criminals, like Thomas Roberts, the aspiring Marine, was, by the Afghan chap who lied about his age after having already killed 2 illegal migrants in another country and fled from Interpol. I think that we should just shut our borders, deport all the foreign criminals, deport every illegal migrant from this country, and not let people in from countries that we know reliably have high rates of criminality, a disrespect for the dignity of women and children, and very low impulse control and intelligence that make them impossible to assimilate into British society.
What did you make of this New Statesman piece, which was talking about the so-called truth about the illegal boats crisis or the small boats crisis? And they described these heartwarming or heartbreaking stories from these supposed asylum seekers who, have had terrible lives and they're just fleeing from war and poverty and all these things. And we should really be compassionate towards these people. That was the statement, or that was the sentiment of this New Statesman piece. What did you make of this argument that, this is just, you've got to show some compassion to these people. They're fleeing from terrible circumstances.
I think we should show compassion to the British public who have voted against receiving these people, either illegally or legally, again, in every election for 50 years, whose country is falling apart around them. Migration is a major issue in terms of crime, in terms of costs, in terms of a feeling of unfamiliarity in your own country. But even without mass migration, we would still have severe economic woes, mismanaged public services, the trains don't work. We've got enough problems of our own, and so by trying to become the world's poor box, as Gus O'Donnell, the former cabinet secretary, told David Goodhart in The Road to Somewhere, pushing for as open borders a immigration policy as possible because his commitment was, quote, to global welfare. I think that's inflicting cruelty upon the British people who have paid for and suffered enough in their own country and are seeing us becoming somewhere between a halfway house of a caliphate and a failed Soviet state. I think we should focus on protecting our own people, improving our own economy, and ensuring that this is a nice country for people like me to raise, God willing, my kids soon in, instead of trying to have handouts to the entire world. And I'm also not going to buy into these confected sob-stories when we know for a fact that men from especially Muslim nations commit a vast amount more of sexual crime. Again, each of these sexual crimes never needed to happen if they weren't here in the first place, against our women and girls than British-born individuals. So we should just say no to this vector of exploitation and criminality. And I don't see a compelling argument either why Britain should have an asylum system for countries that are halfway around the world, that are not culturally proximate, and when these people have shopped around for the country they think will provide them the most in terms of handouts and hotels, and pass through multiple safe countries. Again, Deng Chong Majek, who we just, I suppose, have to take the word for, that is 19, who murdered Rhiannon Sky White, who decided to celebrate in his hotel room with alcohol and lie throughout the trial saying he didn't do it even though he was caught on CCTV because he's completely remorseless. He went through Germany first. Is Germany yet again at war? I must have missed that part. You should not be able to move through multiple countries, reject the asylum offered to you just because you think you can get a better deal in Britain when you arrive. Instead, what I think we should do, we should leverage our privileged status, not just as a close ally of the United States, but also a funder of these international institutions, and either threaten to withdraw from these international institutions and withdraw our funding, or to reform them and make it so that, for example, the 1951 Refugee Convention demands that actual refugees, people fleeing war, as in women and children, not men who are paying people smugglers to be fake asylum seekers, actual refugees have to seek refuge in their continent of origin. And that means, at most, Britain will get a few refugees from France and the Netherlands if it's ever invaded again, which was the original intention of the European Convention on Human Rights, to protect Dutch Jews who were being persecuted by the Holocaust when it was ratified in 1951. I don't think that these constitutions, these international agreements, I think they're antiquated. I don't think they were ever meant to apply to North African sex offenders or Horn of African murderers, and so I think they need an update, and my ears are totally deaf to the pleas of sympathy for these men made by leftist rags like the New Statesman.
Do you believe that Mahmood, the new Home Secretary, will deal with the small boats crisis? This is what everyone's saying in the Westminster media, or a lot of people are saying, we've now got this incredibly competent woman who's going to sort it all out, and, Labour are going to get a grip on this stuff. After many, many promises of smashing the gangs and failing to do so, are we now finally going to see the end of the small boats crisis with this new Home Secretary who's got this kind of magic powers around her?
Well, I wouldn't hold my breath. So, multiple reasons for this. That gives me cause for pessimism. Labour are unwilling to leave these international treaties like the European Convention on Human Rights, to which fake asylum seekers constantly lobby appeals. We know the examples that the Telegraph have published, for example, the Albanian criminal who cited his son's preference for British chicken nuggets for the reason why he shouldn't be deported. They won't actually leave these international treaties that hamstrung our country's ability to deport people. They will instead do these unworkable boondoggles, like a deal with Albania that fell through, or the deal with the French that means we have a one-in, one-out policy. Oh, oops, one guy who already got deported as part of that have come back on the boat anyway. They will dedicate their time and attention to these dead cat strategies because ultimately, I think they want these people in the country. I think that they want to build that multicultural, egalitarian utopia. And so, whether or not a person arrives with the sufficient documents through the passport gates of Heathrow and Gatwick, or rocks up in a dinghy on Dover Beach, having discarded their passport to the bottom of the channel, where there's probably a veritable coral reef of wet documents down there at this point, Labour doesn't believe in any difference between the means of migration arriving here. They still want people to come here. This is why they employ the euphemism of irregular migration. Not illegal, irregular. Implying that, if given the sufficient documents, if given safe and legal routes, then these people would be regulated, counted on the spreadsheet, and there would be no problem. This is why we constantly keep the conversation about the small boats, the immigration conversation about the small boats, because it keeps it in the domain of the, yes, most visually offensive marker of people jumping the queue in terms of immigration and imposing costs and crimes on the population, but they don't actually want to touch the legal migration settlement in any substantive way because they still believe that these people should have a right to come here under human rights doctrine, because they believe that they're just as British as you and me. Their just latent potential hasn't been unlocked yet. So will Mahmoud do that? No, because Keir Starmer won't leave the European Convention on Human Rights because he constantly used it to, for example, write to the Convention on Human Rights on the behalf of now proscribed terror group Hizb ut-Tahrir when the Conservative opposition tried proscribing them in the early 2000s, saying they were an important voice to be heard in democracy. He also wrote the textbook in 1998 for lawyers on how to apply Tony Blair's 1998 Human Rights Act, enshrining the ECHR into British law. So he won't repeal the Human Rights Act, he won't repeal our membership of the European Convention on Human Rights, which is needed to ensure these deportations go off. And I don't think Shabana Mahmood will either crack up the identitarian cartel, which seems to have taken over the Home Office, per mine and your specifically reporting, Stephen, when 700 members of the Islamic network have been lobbying for not just more Muslim staff members to be recruited within the Home Office to enact Muslim needs, but more Muslim migration. We've had members of the Islamic network now prosecuted for taking bribes to overturn rejected asylum applications from Muslim countries like Bangladesh. We've had one member accused of forging documents to prevent a Christian asylum seeker fleeing the forced conversion in an Islamic country by saying her country is safe for Christians when the government has not marked it safe whatsoever. And all of these activists within the Home Office will declare any immigration restriction, particularly from Muslim countries, to be racist, just as they declared prevent racist for focusing on Islamic extremism when it is the number one reason for terrorism in Britain. So I don't think Mahmoud is going to break up that cartel. I don't think she or Keir Starmer are going to repeal the laws getting in the way of deportations. And fundamentally, their ideology wants anyone from everywhere in our country anyway, especially as potential voters, as Labour continue to sink in the polls to fourth place. So no, I don't think this is a competent Home Secretary. I don't think she shares the views and values of the majority of the British public, since she said that her Sunni Muslim faith is the most important thing in her life, and I do not trust her to do her job.
Keir Starmer announced a national inquiry into the rape gangs some time ago. There's been a lot of controversy around that, with members of the inquiry who are grooming gang survivors both supporting and going against the Labour government. What do you make of the progress on this grooming gang inquiry?
What progress? I mean, as far as I understand it, Shabana Mahmood came into the Home Office as Home Secretary, and Yvette Cooper still had not appointed the chair. They still hadn't worked out the terms of reference. The KC they'd originally asked to create the terms of reference hadn't heard back from them from some time, so then they hurriedly had to bring him back into the fold. There's been 5 survivors who've now written a letter, 2 with their names to it, 3 who remain anonymous, saying that Jess Phillips is insufficient as safeguarding minister and should stand down. It's no shock that she's unwilling, or at least recalcitrant, to investigate the racial and religious motivations of the Pakistani rape gangs, given she only won Birmingham Yardley by a few hundred seats and was heckled by Gaza Independence and Workers' Party of Britain candidates for her party's stance on Palestine when she won, so she's only clinging on by a few hundred votes, which could easily be taken away by a Muslim independent candidate in the next election as that constituency grows, so she doesn't want to antagonise that community. And that's what a survivor herself alleged today at a press conference with Nigel Farage, where Farage announced that the inquiry has taken far too long for his liking and turned up absolutely nothing. It seems to be another exercise in containing the outrage that exploded on Twitter earlier this year when Fraser Nelson had the temerity to suggest that Britain was undergoing an integration miracle, and Elon Musk and others happened to note that the rape gangs were still not addressed and was a crime of racial and religious hatred against the white British native population and their children. And anytime this outrage explodes, we get an inquiry, and it's quickly buried in manipulated statistics or obfuscation or various committees, and very little is done about it. It's why nobody's not only lost their jobs, but not been prosecuted for presiding over the cover-up, whether it's in local authorities or in government or in the police. And we now know that police officers themselves have been charged with participating in the rape gangs, not just arresting the fathers who tried to free their daughters or arresting the children who were victimized and calling them child prostitutes, but have been allegedly participating in the rapes themselves as part of the gang. So the idea that the government is making traction on this when they still haven't appointed the chair, that apparently some of the advisors have been telling the survivors themselves, don't blame it all on brown men, that's racist, according to comments printed in the Telegraph in the last week. And now that Lucy Powell has been elected Deputy Labour Party leader, when only a few months ago she was telling Tim Montgomery that even talking about the rape gangs is a racist dog whistle, shows that the government isn't serious. They see it as an electoral liability to be honest about this issue, and they're going to continue to drag their feet and obfuscate the true identity and motivations of these perpetrators, because otherwise it harms their electoral chances.
So Fraser Nelson, a columnist for The Times, tweeted this recently. In Oldham and Rochdale, it was grooming gangs of mainly Pakistani heritage. In Blackpool, white men acting alone. In Glasgow, drug addicts. Same evil, different faces. An inquiry cannot confine itself to only one aspect of this scourge. What do you make of those arguments that the grooming gang inquiry should not just focus on the Pakistani aspect, the Muslim aspect, but it should really look at every single rape or grooming across the country?
Well, Fraser Nelson doesn't even think there's such a thing as an English person. You can just swear an oath of allegiance to vague British values that he himself couldn't define in an exchange with Constantine Kissin, and therefore you're as British or English as you and me. So it's no wonder that he doesn't think this is a particularly important issue to focus on, because he can't even define the group that is being preyed upon and the group that is preying upon them. The idea that we haven't already had a broad inquiry is ridiculous. We had the Casey and the Jay inquiries, and they focused on all sorts of... one was focused specifically on Rotherham, the other was focused on all sorts of child sexual abuse, be it from the church, be it in social care settings, and some was focused on the rape gangs, but did not examine the racial and religious motives of the rapists, despite us having an abundance of quotes and evidence from over the years, be it back from the 2013 Muslim Women's Network report, where she interviewed young Muslim men, young Asian, but I think that's quite an unfair moniker to give to the Japanese and Sikhs in our country who aren't doing this sort of thing, men who then said, well, you know, white girls just cry rape when they actually want to be attacked, in various quotes in that report, when we've had numerous perpetrators, including in a transcript read out by Katie Lamb in Parliament, say we're here to F white girls and F the government, meaning there's a political dimension to these crimes, when we know that they underwent horrific torture, and when the survivors themselves said, I was made to stand in a corner and had epithets shouted at me and had to read Quran verses, when the victims have been attacked by the families of the perpetrators, either calling them liars, physically assaulting them at the courthouses and having to be restrained by courthouse security, when the families of the perpetrators have shouted out, I love you, Dad, during court proceedings, as reported by Charlie Peters for GB News, despite knowing what their fathers have done, and as Yasmin Ali Hobby Brown reported in The Mail about a decade ago now, when asked, do you have any sympathy with the girls that have been abused by your family members who have preyed on them because they are white girls, they've said, by Allah, have you seen how they've dressed, implying that because they're not Muslim, they deserved it. This is something that the head of the Ramadan Foundation said in 2016 when 3 of his cousins were prosecuted for being part of a rape gang in Rotherham. He said the British Pakistani community knows about this, but, quote, they don't want to be seen as siding with the white enemy. And that's why they don't speak up. And so it's not a shock that people want to broaden out the inquiry and want to sort of bury the uncomfortable conversations that you can't have at North London dinner parties about how some imported communities harbour a racial and religious hatred towards us that doesn't seem to be going away with a Scout's Pledge of British Values, because frankly the implication is frightful for our formerly high trust, homogenous, individualistic morality and culture. Because if a community has knowledge of this, the problem is so widespread that, upwards of, even Ella Cockbain, an academic, in her sample, that 80% of the perpetrators of group-based child or sexual exploitation in this manner were ethnically Pakistani. And if the families know about it, then even if we're applying individual justice here, it starts to look like collective community punishment, because lots of these people will be going to prison, lots of the people will need to be deported, lots of these people will need to be sent to Pakistan, and it will look, as Rupert Lowe said, like we will be deporting whole communities, because so many people are implicated in this that there will be very few people of those communities left behind once we have a proper accounting for the crime that has been ravaged here. And I'm sure that it makes North London dinner party liberals like Fraser Nelson or Michael Gove or the likes who have presided over this situation and championed the immigration policies that brought here very uncomfortable. But I'm sorry, we need a sniper shot style inquiry that focuses on the uncomfortable aspects to ensure that nothing like this ever happens again. And I would rather be called racist by the BBC for focusing on this than have another rape gang on my conscience because I didn't focus on it.
Did you find it interesting that the media were not asking about the rape gangs to Farage and to the rape gang survivor, but they were only focusing on those comments that we talked about earlier from Farage's MP about black people on adverts?
Yeah, Ellie Reynolds, who was the survivor in question, actually called it out. She said that you constantly bang on about racism, but you, for years, implicating the entire media here, ignored the racial and religious motivations by her abusers, who were calling the girls, and I apologise for my language, but white slags, white whores, and were treating them as beneath contempt. I mean, Martin Daubney and your various shows on GB News have had Dr. Taj Hargay on multiple times. He's an imam from the Oxford Islamic Centre. He has slightly less orthodox readings of Islam than some of the other more radical clerics in our country, and that makes him quite a sensible man. And he's pointed out that, unlike him, lots of the imams won't speak up against this problem in their congregations. This is something Ed Hussein documented in Among the Mosques. There are imams that refuse to preach sermons against grooming and raping white girls because they teach their congregations that anyone outside of the Islamic faith is basically fair game for mistreatment. This is the concept of asabaya we discussed in a previous interview, Stephen, where it has a clannish morality that means that you only extend moral consideration to yourself, your family, your broader clan network, and your ummah, which is essentially the global Muslim race, rather than the individualistic, universalist morality that Christianity and then sort of English liberalism has extended to everyone and essentially allows us to have a vector for exploitation. It's why our liberal media now considers racism to be the peak moral sin, but the exact communities that they're protecting with accusations of racism levelled at people talking about the grooming gangs don't see racism as a problem. They actually see racism as the limit of which they would extend moral consideration to outgroups. And so she's absolutely right to say that this is appalling to focus on a non-entity scandal that offends polite Westminster dinner party sensibilities regarding Sarah Pochin that we discussed earlier, meanwhile ignoring, at a press conference about it, the worst child sexual abuse scandal that has ever been committed in Britain and is still going on today, including in places like London.
What do you make of Farage himself? Obviously, he held this press conference with the grooming gang survivor. You've been critical in the past of Farage's views on immigration and other matters where he's not being radical enough. Do you feel that he's changed? Do you feel that he has moved more in your direction?
So I would quibble with the term radical, Stephen, only because I think that enforcing the law is not radical. I thought that his answer to your initial questions in that interview last year about mass deportations and whether or not it was his ambition to remove every illegal immigrant from the country was inadequate at the time. And he has now changed his mind and said we're doing mass deportations. He has promised 150,000 a year. Now, I think that number is far too low. I think actually the logistics that we have at our disposal, whether it's military chartered flights or just the capacity that our airports operate at every year, means that we can actually deport the at least 2 million illegal immigrants that have been estimated to be in this country since 2017. They stopped keeping track in 2021 when the Boris wave started. And we've also had 150 to 180,000 small boat crossers break into the country ever since 2018, so it's almost certainly 2 million. But I think we can get rid of those 2 million within a parliamentary term, just with the will and the gumption. And I hope that with some of the decent people I know in reform and some of the excellent people that they're beginning to recruit, like my dear friend, Cambridge academic and J.D. Vance's mentor, James Orr, that they're taking it in a more serious and thoughtful direction, that they're actually going to be able to flesh out these policies and unpick the Japanese knotweed of human rights laws and civil service non-compliance that will try and throw grit in the gears of actually getting mass deportations done. And the encouraging thing that I have seen, not just with today's press conference about the grooming gang inquiry, which Farage originally committed to, didn't make good on, Rupert Lowe funded a private inquiry, and he's now trying to do something in Parliament, which is commendable. Something I am encouraged by is the reflexive, defensive posture that Reform took in the face of being accused of being racist by ITV, Sky News, the BBC, you name it, any single media entity that would like to see them capsize rather than succeed. They have instead learned to go on the attack. So Nigel Farage applauded Ellie when she said, "How dare you focus on Sarah Pochin's comments rather than the anti-white racism by our child rapist abusers, by the Pakistani rape gangs." And Nigel cheered that on, didn't just sit there and denounce it. And the other encouraging thing I saw was when Danny Kruger defected. And rather than ask Kruger about his defection and what his role will be in reform, the media constantly asked Nigel Farage to sit there and disavow in ritualistic fashion Elon Musk and Tommy Robinson for being at the Unite the Kingdom rally, where a few 100,000 to possibly 1 million people peacefully marched, waving their flags and attending some speeches and doing far less violence and racist rhetoric than the likes of the pro-Palestine marches have been since October the 7th. Nigel Farage said, "You know what? I'm not going to sit there and denounce Elon Musk and Tommy Robinson, even though they don't like me very much, even though they're not part of my party. Instead, I think that you should feel ashamed of yourselves by allowing these pro-Palestine marches to make British Jews feel unsafe, and by allowing your mass migration policies to intimidate and make women feel unsafe in their own capital cities, because about a third to a quarter of sex crimes are committed by foreign men who never needed to be in the country in the first place." I think what Reform have learned now, through perhaps bitter experience, is that they need better personnel, they need better policy, but they also need a better media strategy, because you will never be accepted by the mainstream media, who exist to gatekeep the parameters of polite political discussion, and those polite political parameters include excusing the Pakistani rape gangs for many decades. You don't want their approval. Instead, you want the approval of the left-behind, indigenous working majority in this country, who are now putting them consistently at the top of the polls. And so, despite my criticisms of Reform before, I still stay a critical friend, Stephen, because I never give anyone my undying loyalty, save my wife and my family, of course. But I am encouraged by the movements they're making towards stronger policy, towards stronger rhetoric, and to living up to the potential that has been given to them by the electorate that are sick of both the Labour and the Tories betraying them.
There was a really interesting clip of Farage speaking on an interview with Bloomberg, I think, where he was talking about the books that he was reading, and he said that he was studying a book about the Salisbury Convention in the House of Lords, and basically thinking about the Constitution and the kind of blockages that he might expect from the civil service, from the House of Lords, if he were to implement the policies that he wants to implement. Do you think this suggests that Farage and the people around him are taking preparation for government seriously? Do you think that they're appointing the right people? Do you think that they're asking the right questions? I mean, maybe Danny Kruger is a great example of where they're heading.
I would hope so. Appointing the right people, jury's still out on that, because for every Matt Goodwin or James Orr or Danny Kruger, they have a Nadine Dorries or a Jake Berry defecting to them and treating Reform like it's a refugee camp or a retirement home for the exact same Tories who caused the problems of yesteryear. Never forget, Nadine Dorries said live on Sky News she would throw Jimmy Carr in prison for a joke, so I don't think that's the best for Reform trying to demolish the Unity Party. However, I do think the fact that Farage is citing such a book. I know that you're fascinated with Lord Salisbury. I'm guilty of playing catch up on history. I'm more of a philosophy man at the moment myself, and I do think that we all have our part to play in building a parallel media ecosystem outside of the leftist echo chamber, where the likes of Douglas Carswell and Dominic Cummings and Liz Truss even, and David Starkey are all singing from the same hymn sheet and saying, yeah, it's Blair's constitutional revolution that's at fault. You need to repeal the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act 2010, the Constitutional Reform Act, get rid of the Supreme Court, leave the ECHR, reform the 1951 UN Refugee Convention, or leave it outright, regain parliamentary sovereignty from all these quangos and supernatural bodies and unaccountable civil servants who are more powerful and can actually remove elected ministers. I think the fact that everyone is saying this in succession, in the same sphere, means that this idea is building as a critical consciousness in the minds of Reform, who, even if they weren't paying attention at the start and were just focusing on carrying a Ming vase carefully over the line to win electoral politics in the by-elections and the local elections and Wales and Scotland, now they're thinking, okay, we have to have an oven-ready plan for governance, especially if Labour calls a snap election because of a looming financial crisis and them hemorrhaging support to the Greens and Jezbollah. So we need to be ready to go in less than 4 years even. And so we need to know exactly what's going to get in our way on day one, and we need to be Trump term 2 and not Trump term 1. And so what I hope actually that we're seeing now is the growth of that ecosystem, that kind of Centre for Policy Studies style think tank brain trust that Margaret Thatcher relied on for her economic reforms and how to bust the unions in whichever contentious way that she did. What I hope is that we're seeing, with the appointment of James Orr, with the open ear to what was formerly disparaged as the online right from which the call for mass deportations came, is that Reform realise the mountain they have to climb, they realise the pieces of legislation and people getting in their way, and they are committed to acting with courage and conviction in order to remove those obstacles and in order to make good on their promise to, well, dare I say, restore the country that we're currently living in.
Well, clearly the very online right just have no influence whatsoever. I do want to ask about Boris Johnson, though, to end the interview. There is some talk, as always, of him coming back, leading the Tory party, taking them back to their former glory. He was the guy who took on Farage, and he beat him in the 2019 election when Farage stood down a load of candidates. Is this the moment? This is what we're all waiting for. We need Boris Johnson yet again to save us from this tyranny.
The Boris Johnson is only the answer to one question, and that is, who inflicted the largest wave of unwanted migration on this country in British history? Boris Johnson has brought more colonial conquerors to Britain than the Norman conquest himself. So, no, Boris Johnson, not the answer. Boris Johnson, bear in mind, went against the advice of the Pro-Migration Migration Advisory Committee in 2018, who said, we don't think it's a good idea to uncap student-dependent and social health and care worker visas because this will be exploited. He did that, and hey presto, hundreds of thousands of net dependents came into our country. 95% of the immigrants, and that's a generous estimation, as part of the Boris wave, came in as net tax drains. So we are hemorrhaging money. We are having our home populated by total strangers. They are culturally distant, far more than that of the Anglosphere and Western Europe that we had as the lion's share of immigration pre-Brexit. And Boris remains unrepentant in this. Boris did multiple unnecessary measures in order to human quantitative ease his way out of the money that he and Rishi Sunak recklessly printed to get us through COVID lockdowns, which he also imposed on us, by the way. He removed a Gordon Brown law that meant that you have to advertise British jobs to British workers first, making us like a global job centre for some reason. He extended the requirement for the number of years or number of months that foreign students could stay in the country without getting employment, which meant that they also then switched onto other visas like Asylum, and so the entire visa system just became a way to rubber stamp your way to get indefinite leave to remain forever. And I heard from a source who worked closely with Boris that lots of ministers, including him, didn't even know indefinite leave to remain existed, and so didn't know this would be an inevitable consequence from lifting the time caps on the visas that they printed recklessly, like the money they also printed during COVID. So Boris Johnson is wholly inadequate. He has not apologised for his role in flooding our country with the Boris wave. He continues to falsely obfuscate and and say, well, it was only Ukrainian refugees, Hong Kongers, and doctors and nurses. Less than 3% were doctors and nurses, by the way, and there were only a few 100,000 Ukrainians and Hong Kongers who were not given indefinite leave to remain because, God willing, they get their homelands back eventually. He and Priti Patel are responsible for the biggest betrayal of the British electorate. And the idea that he could be back, rather than his career being permanently hasta la vista, as he once joked, is laughable. Though what I am noticing, Stephen, as I mentioned with Reform becoming a refugee camp, is that his allies are attempting to feather the nest for his landing. And this has caused the likes of Matt Goodwin and Zia Yusuf, staunch Reform supporters and spokespeople, to come out and say there is never a place for Boris Johnson, architect of the Boris wave, in a party that only exists because of the migration mess that he caused. And that is, yet again, another reason to be encouraged by Reform's recent output. Boris Johnson must never allow to cosplay as Winston Churchill ever again. The Boris wave, like it or not, will always be his legacy, and it should never be forgotten, and it certainly shouldn't be forgiven.
Connor, thank you very much.
Pleasure.